Now, I'm gonna tell you something that you will probably never read anywhere. And no one will ever tell you about John Florio, and no Florio scholars has ever mentioned it. Hi everyone, welcome back to John Florio channel. I am Mary and I'm here to talk about John Florio. In my last video I talked about Shakespeare's unique use of Bruno's works in his plays and the important connection between Giordano Bruno and John Florio at the French embassy in London. Now, it is important for you to understand how those years at the French embassy were important not just for Shakespeare but also and most importantly for John Florio. Bruno and Florio moved at the French embassy in London in 1583 after the experience at Oxford University. For Bruno, those were happy years in which he focused on his studies after the uproar with the Oxford academics. But we will see how he also encountered many troubles and problems in London as well, but generally he was able to work and study safely and he was surrounded by people who loved and esteemed him. The French ambassador, Michel de Castelnau, his daughter, a little 9 years old girl named Catherine, Philip Sidney and John Florio. Bruno in those years wrote the most important works of his career and of modern philosophy. Those works, as I have explained you in the past videos, influenced Shakespeare's plays. The Ash Wednesday Supper, On the Heroic Francis, On the Cause, Principle and Unit, The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, The Universe Infinite and Words. I will explain you later how these works contain other sources that Shakespeare used in his plays and I haven't mentioned it yet. Now, these were generally great years for Bruno at the embassy, but what about Florio? How those years with Bruno changed him? Now, I'm gonna tell you something that you will probably never read anywhere, and no one will ever tell you about John Florio, and no Florio scholars has ever mentioned it. Florio moved to London at the French embassy with Bruno after he realized that he wanted to be more than just a teacher. This hasn't been stressed enough, but those years were the most important years for Florio's personal growth, for his life. Bruno changed his way of thinking, his way of living, his thought, his attitude, his vision of life. He changed everything about Florio. Before Bruno, Florio was a talented, ingenious, passionate writer who struggled to find a place in the London literary world. Most importantly, he didn't know how to address this talent. He had this urge to express himself, to share his love, his knowledge for literature, poetry and theatre. But at the same time, he knew that he faced many problems. First, and was the most important problem, the fact that he was basically considered a foreign, and foreigners didn't have the same opportunities that English writers had in England. If you were a foreign, you could either become a private teacher or work in a public school, or you could work as a translator. These were the three best options, so you couldn't experiment much. But Florio was different. He felt different. He had a humanistic culture that very few had at the time. He came from a European background, a European formation, having been in Germany, learning Italian studies. He was also very conscious of his own worth and wanted to use his knowledge and passion for literature in his country, England. But the first years of his career were not easy. When he published his first work, First Fruits, he introduced himself in the preface by writing, "I'm neither Italian nor English, and I'm not a teacher. Sorry." And he wrote this work to express his love for Italian literature, showing to be a voracious reader who nicked stuff from everywhere, borrowing from Ariosto, Boccaccio and from classic literature, Ovid, Plutarch. his contemporaries like Thomas North, and a great number of French, Spanish translations he readapted, while at the same time criticizing English language by defining it a language made of different tongues that none outside England will ever use it. So he pretended to be a teacher. He was selling himself as a teacher because there was nothing better that London could offer. But with that work, Florio was trying to impress his patron, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, by convincing him that he could be a teacher too. Why? Because Florio at the time had contact with the theatre company of his patron, the Leicester's Company. His friends were Richard Tarleton, Robert Wilson. Those were his friends. That was his circle. That's what he was doing in London. A man who was in contact with a theatre company and at the same time trying to sell himself as a teacher who wanted to change and improve English language because he didn't like it. How pretentious! So before Bruno, Florio was an unstable writer, balancing himself between doing what he really wanted to do or doing the same thing every day, teacher, and make a necessity virtue. Before Bruno, Florio was more insecure, doubtful on his career and his place in the world. And this comes from the fact that Florio had an identity crisis. Why? Florio was born in London. His father was Italian. We know nothing about his mother, but it's possible his mother was either English or French. He had Jewish ancestors. He was a mix of different cultures and languages. And he came back to England at 18 years old, defining himself as Englishman, when in reality he was perceived by everyone around him as a stranger. That gave him many insecurities, and he struggled to understand who he really was, which was his place in the world. And in England there was also a particular situation, because while the aristocracy loved everything about Italian culture and Italian literature, English citizens were extremely xenophobic towards foreigners, and they saw foreigners as dangerous. So people around Florio didn't see him as an Englishman, but as a stranger. Also because Florio was not white, he was swarthy. So despite he knew English language better than everyone else, despite he described himself as Englishman at heart, people look at him and say, "Nah, you're a stranger." And in the first period of his career, this gave him a lot of problems concerning his identity, his mental stability. But it also gave him the strength to do more and to demonstrate to the world that he was not less good than others. Florio's whole life can be described as this adventurous, beautiful and stormy path of a man who struggled to impose himself as English writer. That's why at a certain point in his life he decided to try and collaborate anonymously. He felt safer. By being invisible, he could be free to express himself, and hiding behind his friends, he could carry on his mission. When he knew Bruno, everything changed. He understood the power to be in that liminal space, the power to be different. He was an outsider, he stood out from the crowd, he didn't have to be like the crowd. And while before he thought that this could be a flaw, with Bruno, he understood the beauty in diversity, in being different, in thinking outside the box. He understood that the mix of his blood, of his identity, of his formation, London, Italy, England, Europe, that was unique, that was an extraordinary gift that life gave him. In a world, the Elizabethan era, in which white was the symbol of purity, of beauty, of goodness, Florio promoted diversity, and he fostered a mingle-mangle of mixed races and languages. He made of his identity a unique status symbol. And no matter what people around him said, how much his enemies attacked him, he carried on his mission until the end. That's why none has such a huge influence on John Florio more than Giordano Bruno. During those years at the French embassy in London, through the beautiful revolutionary ideas that Bruno passed to Florio, their friendship, their union gave birth to this monstrous body of knowledge that Florio will become in the next years, a mix of Bruno's thirst for knowledge and truth in a word he expressed in his works, and Florio's passion for language and words. Stay resolute. Bye.